Welcome to Politically Georgia from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Greg Bluestein here with Washington Bureau Chief Tia Mitchell. Hey, Tia.
Hey, Greg.
So this is one of our favorite times of the week. It is our Monday mailbag episode where we dedicate the episode to answering questions, comments, feedback from you, our listeners, in our Monday mailbag edition. You can always reach us either at politicallygeorgia@ajc.com or by calling our 24/7 hotline, 770-810-5297. Producer Shaney B and his legion of interns, we just restocked our internship pool. They're waiting and they're standing by for your calls, your comments, your feedback. Shaney B, we got a lot of questions this week.
Let's start with Kevin in Stone Mountain. Kevin writes, Lieutenant Governor Burt Jones said the goodbye after the special session might not be goodbye if Kemp calls lawmakers back to redraw maps in November. Walk me through it. Who actually has the power to force a redistricting session? And what would have to happen on election night for that threat to become real?
Yeah, this is something we've been warning about. You've written about it. I've written about it. We've talked about it. It's very, very likely, highly probable that there'll be another special session this year. If Keisha Lance Bottoms wins the governor's race, I can almost guarantee there'll be another special session. But even if she doesn't, even if Rick Jackson wins, there might be one as well. If Mayor Bottoms wins, it's because, frankly, that means that she'll be in office and she'd never sign any sort of map overhaul that would dilute black voting power and black voting strength in Georgia. And we've seen, or we at least talked about, some of the potential maps out there responding to the Supreme Court ruling that would flip, if not one, maybe two Democratic-held seats to the GOP.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost guaranteed not just if Mayor Bottoms wins, but let's say Rick Jackson wins governor, but Josh McLaurin wins lieutenant governor. They're doing a special session if they think any Democrats are going to get power, because they would get sworn in January. Republicans who currently have all the power would try to rush through not just new maps, but other new laws if they think Democrats will be getting power in January. I do agree with you, Greg. The calculus is a little bit different if Rick Jackson wins, although I do think there would be some Burt Jones, maybe allies, who would want to pass some laws and pass some maps while Burt Jones still has power. But there would then be Rick Jackson allies who say, wait a minute, let's not go too far. We want to let the new governor have some say. So it would definitely not be as certain if Republicans retain power. But I still think there are a lot of Republicans who would like to go ahead and get it out of the way, quite frankly. And that's another reason why not get it out of the way before the general election, because they don't want it to be a rallying cry for Democrats, but they do want to go ahead and get it out of the way well before the 2028 elections. So, we're looking at the strong possibility.
Yeah. And look, Republicans were privately making the argument, let's get it done in June because that's when a lot of folks are on vacation. They're not paying as much attention. Well, holiday season would be another time where, folks aren't as tuned into politics as after the November campaign. You could also make the case that even if Rick Jackson wins and Republicans sweep other offices, that they don't want their first incoming Rick Jackson administration doesn't want one of his first acts to be a very divisive overhaul of congressional lines. Let's let the previous regime do it. So you could even see that happening as well. Shaney B, what else we got?
All right, next we have a text message from Darla in Alpharetta. Darla writes, did Georgia have a booth at the 4th of July celebration in Washington?
All right, Darla. So, I don't know if this is going to satisfy you or disappoint you, but yes, to an extent. So what you're talking about is the Great American State Fair. It was open for 2 weeks in Washington. Every state and territory had the opportunity to have a little booth to talk about their state, but it was very costly for states to participate. Some states chose not to do it for that reason. Other states, this is what I think Georgia did, got corporate sponsors. And so the Georgia booth is very reflective of who paid to be in the booth. So you had the poultry industry. The Georgia Poultry Federation had these kind of displays, kind of museum-like, where you just read about the poultry industry in Georgia. Georgia's economic development arm had a display and kind of like a nice little map of Georgia. The Vidalia onion industry had a display and some fake Vidalia onions.
Ooh.
And then Waffle House had a jukebox where you could add your song to the playlist. That was the one interactive thing they had. You could add a song to the Waffle House jukebox and then take some Waffle House facts home with you. It was kind of lame, you know? So I will tell you that Georgia's booth, people were walking in and out. Only 2 states that I saw had like a line to get in. That was Florida and that was New York. It was very hot outside, so I cannot tell you what was in those booths because I was not standing in line. But for Georgia, you could just walk on in and get your little fake passport stamped. Yes, it was for states, but they had like a little passport, give you prizes if you go to different states. And then they had a Ferris wheel.
Okay.
They had a little rodeo.
This is for the overall fair, not just Georgia.
The overall Great American State Fair. They did have a Ferris wheel. That was the only kind of fair ride. And they had some food.
Okay.
And here's how you know a fair is kind of lame, Greg. Yeah. No lines at the food when I went.
Okay. Well, the verdict on that fair is kind of meh. Jenny B, what else we got?
All right, let's move on to Jessica in Brookhaven, who writes, Mike Collins keeps saying Trump won in 2020 while also saying he's moved on to 2026. Can a Senate candidate actually have it both ways, or does that position eventually catch up with him in a swing state general?
I feel like you can't have it both ways, right? And I've asked him this question, Tia. I know you've asked him this question. He says that the 2020 election was, in his words, quote, legitimately rigged. He says that, basically the pandemic era rules that allowed a lot more mail-in balloting is what led to the Democratic victories, although he also says Trump won. And this came into the fore a few days ago when CNN's Manu Raju interviewed him, where he said, something different than he's told us in recent days, at least. I was with him the Sunday before the runoff and asked him this direct question, and he did not say Trump won. He just said that it was, legitimately rigged and blah, blah, blah. Whereas he told CNN that Trump won, but he wants to focus on 2026. Tia, this is directly playing into a Democratic argument to the middle of the electorate, right? The base, the Republican base that's going to be with Mike Collins no matter what, he no longer really needs to energize as much. But the middle of the road voters who, stood by Brad Raffensperger, Brian Kemp, the Republicans who affirmed Joe Biden's narrow victory in Georgia in 2020, don't necessarily want to see this relitigated over and over again in the same way that it was in 2022.
But guess who does like to see it relitigated and is with Mike Collins? Yep. That's President Donald Trump. And I think that's why we're seeing him say these things, honestly. He's not saying it to win voters in Georgia or win anyone's support other than Donald Trump's support, which he already has Trump's endorsement. But I think this is kind of is part of the deal. When you are backed by President Donald Trump, he expects blind loyalty, which means he expects you to continue to say the 2020 election was rigged, because that's what he continues to say. But that blind loyalty to Trump could come at a cost when it comes to actually winning an election, particularly in Georgia, where I think those voters in the middle are kind of tired of the fact that we're still talking about the 2020 election 6 years later. So he's, I think, making a calculus that he wants to keep Trump, loyal and not lose that support, but it could come at a cost.
Yeah, it's also authentic to who Mike Collins is. I mean, maybe his most famous, his most provocative campaign ad in 2022 was him basically opening fire on a voting machine, calling it a federal hijacking, that the 2020 election was a federal hijacking in his words. So that's an ad that helped him win the congressional race in a deep red Northeast Georgia district. But, we always say that some of these things could come back to haunt you. And certainly John Ossoff and his allies will not relent in reminding middle of the road, independent, swing voters who are tiring of Donald Trump, you name it, of Mike Collins's past stance. And should he kind of retreat from it, it would look like a giant flip-flop. So it is authentic to who he is, but it's also not the general election message that he'd love to embrace right now. Shani B, what else we got?
Now we have a question from Brian in Dunwoody, who writes, the Georgia Supreme Court agreed to hear the Fulton County Election Board case in the fall. Why did this end up at the state's highest court instead of getting resolved locally?
Yeah, this is super complicated because the Fulton County Commissioners, they've refused to seat Julie Adams and Jason Frazier to the 5-member Fulton County Board of Elections. Both were nominated by the Fulton County GOP. Adams voted against certifying the results of the 2024 primary election. Frazier challenged thousands of voter registrations in the deep blue Democratic county. So the fight's been winding its way back and forth here. There's been a lot of controversy. Georgia's Court of Appeals ruled in March that the county officials could refuse to seat the nominees. That reversed a lower court decision. So now we're in the state's highest court, and we're going to be closely watching what the Supreme Court of Georgia rules on this.
Yeah, I do think there is a lot of interest there because on one hand, it kind of determines, do these local county commissions, like in Fulton County, but this would apply to every county, can they override an appointment by, an outside entity to a county-controlled body? I think it'll be really interesting to see what the court decides.
Let's take a quick break. When we come back, let's tackle more of your questions, including whether split ticket voting is still a thing. This is Politically Georgia from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Welcome back to Politically Georgia. It's Greg Bluestein and Tia Mitchell on a Monday mailbag edition. Before we move on to your next questions, a quick message. Of course, thank you for listening to our podcast. And if you're also a subscriber to the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, an even more dose of thank you. AJC subscriptions are what can make Politically Georgia possible. So if you're not yet a subscriber, we invite you to become one. You'll get even more reporting, insight, and analysis during this year's critically important election in the AJC and in our subscriber Politically Georgia newsletter. We might even see you in person at one of our many subscriber events. Be more than a listener. Become a subscriber at ajc.com/start. Okay, let's get back to the mailbag. Shani B., who's next?
Next is Brittany in Marietta, who writes, Republicans put an ad out blaming Democrats for killing the property tax cut, but Democrats say it would have just raised sales taxes instead. As a regular homeowner, how do I even sort out which version is true?
Tia, this is a battle of messaging that we're seeing because both are true at the same time, right? Democrats can say essentially that this Republican-backed property tax overhaul could lead local counties and cities to raise their sales taxes to kind of fill in the gaps, while Republicans can say Democrats blocked these local referendums for these property tax cuts to come in quicker. Right now, we see Republicans right out the gate trying to control that messaging battle with a 6-figure, 7-figure backed digital ad that could expand into even more TV broadcasting, essentially making the case that it's Democrats to blame for this property tax block. Now, Democrats are going to argue the counter, but at this point, it matters who has the money to get that message out.
Right. And I think what Democrats don't often say out loud, and maybe it's because they don't think it will resonate as much, but the difference between property tax and sales tax is also who shoulders more of the burden, right? Mm-hmm. Sales tax is kind of a flat tax. We all pay the same amount, no matter if we're a billionaire or the poorest family with very little income and a lot of mouths to feed. And some people listening might say, well, yeah, that should be the case. We all pay the same. But a billionaire can afford a 7 or 8 or 9 or 10% sales tax on goods much more than someone who's poor, where they're counting every penny. So that's another reason why Democrats don't like basically moving property taxes into sales tax. So it's really a shifting of the tax burden, right?
Yeah.
You can say, well, it doesn't have to shift, but then you're talking about, well, what are you going to do without to cut down on the lost revenue? And we know voters and people don't like hearing that you're going to lose access to services or, infrastructure. So property taxes, poor people tend to not own homes and they tend to not pay property taxes. And landlords, even when you have rental property taxes, Yes, they're passed along somewhat, but again, because the poorest people in America, they may have subsidized housing and things like that. So they're still not getting that transfer over of the property taxes, which means, and again, property taxes, the richer you are, the bigger your home, the more you pay in property taxes versus even if you're a middle income family, you might pay it, but you're definitely not paying as much as, Rick Jackson in his big mansion. So that's another, I think, part of the debate that doesn't always get talked about because maybe it doesn't play as well or maybe it's a little bit wonky, but you got to think about that as far as the impact of going from property taxes to a flat tax like a sales tax.
Yeah, the disproportionate impact. That's exactly right. And that is sort of one of the main Democratic arguments we heard in a special session that surprisingly became a proxy battle over tax fights, right? We did not go into that special session thinking that the tax debate would become a big one. Thought it would be about redistricting for a while. Then we thought it would be at least about this QR code and election process battle. And instead, I think the biggest takeaway was this Democratic using what little leverage they had because these votes took 2/3 majorities. So that's one of the only areas you can see Democrats standing firm that could actually defeat a united Republican caucus over was blocking these local referendums on property tax hikes and cuts. So that became the surprise wedge issue that I think will continue to dominate through the general election. I think we're going to hear a lot more about this, Tia. Shani B., what else we got?
Next is Bill in Decula. Bill writes, Brad Raffensperger has been saying his office has been ready to ditch the QR code voting machines, but lawmakers never funded it. The legislature seems to be blaming him anyway. Who's actually responsible for fixing Georgia's voting system, and why does it keep getting punted?
That's a perfect segue from our last question because, this was supposed to be a session where lawmakers finally figured out what to do with the QR code voting machines and the self-imposed July 1st deadline that has now come and gone. And they could not figure it out, Tia, the last regular session that ended back in April. So we all knew as the final gavel was struck that we'd be back in some sort of special session or let the courts figure it out. Lawmakers said, you know what, we'll come back. Governor Kemp called them back for that special session. They still didn't figure out what to do with it. Instead, they delayed the deadline until 2028. Meaning that we expect lawmakers to do something next year. And you can see the argument for letting a new governor, a new secretary of state, a new batch of lawmakers hash this out because this is now a lame duck session. So Governor Kemp was okay with punting. Other state leaders were okay with punting. But really, it comes down to the state legislature. It is their responsibility to figure this out. They can blame and point fingers at Brad Raffensperger all they want. And he's been a familiar foil for a lot of fellow Republicans for a long time, ever since he defied Trump's call to overturn the election back in 2020. But when it comes down to it, it's up to the legislature to figure this out.
And part of the reason why it's been so tough for the legislature is Republicans are not on one accord on this. Again, we have to remember that this voting system with the QR codes was implemented by Republicans. Mm-hmm. Many of them voted for it, and they're still in office. And the skepticism about the QR codes is tied into kind of the whole misinformation and disinformation surrounding the 2020 election. And so it's tied up in conspiracy theories. Don't get me wrong, there may be legitimate concerns about the voting system and whether the QR codes could be tampered with or hacked or, protect people's privacy. I'm not saying that you can't have a real debate, but the debate as it stands right now is partially informed by misinformation and conspiracy theories tied to false allegations from the 2020 election. And again, it's about a system that Republicans implemented. And then the other question is, they don't have a good idea of what's better or what could come next. For example, you hear a lot of Republicans now, because of Donald Trump, saying hand-marked paper ballots. That is something, again, our legislature rejected when they approved new voter system, new voting machines. And the data shows that hand-marked paper ballots are more susceptible to human error, accidental overvotes, things like that. So when you look at the actual data, the electronic voting systems, and the legislature knows this, are found to be a little bit more efficient because people are able to double check and make sure that who they wanted to vote for is who shows up on the screen. So do they want to go to hand-marked paper ballots and introduce the more likelihood of human error just to appease Trump? Do they kick the can down the road and wonder if public sentiment among their own party shifts in a couple of years? I think that's also part of the discussion.
Is there a state more than Georgia that has been more affected by the shadow of 2020? I can't think of any state that
I don't
still...
think so.
Yeah.
Maybe Arizona.
Maybe, yeah. But between
Maybe.
the election interference trial that's, of course, now gone, between folks like Brad Raffensperger, Jeff Duncan running unsuccessful campaigns for governor, Burt Jones as well, who is a Republican elector, between the continuing insistence on, we just talked about Mike Collins insisting falsely that Trump won in 2020. I mean, the shadow of 2020 is just still looms over everything in Georgia.
Yeah, for sure. And I think many Republicans, like the Raffenspergers and the Chris Carrs and the Brian Kemps, would like us to move on, And quite frankly, the fact that I named 3 people who didn't have super successful, election season this year shows that they might want to move on, but their party has not and is not moving on currently.
Yeah. Shani B., what else we got? We have time for one more?
We do. Let's wrap it up with Eric in Atlanta, who writes, a conservative radio host endorsed both Ossoff for Senate and Jackson for governor in the same week. Is split ticket voting actually a thing in Georgia, or is that guy an outlier?
Yes, Eric, you're talking about Shelley Winter, our friend over at WSB Radio, who has a very successful evening program over there. Shelley shocked a lot of people by endorsing Jon Ossoff a few days ago. He did not shock that many people by endorsing Rick Jackson a few days later, because he's a very conservative pundit and analyst who has a lot of newsmakers. He has a lot of Democrats on the show as well. But Tia, split ticket voting is not an anomaly in Georgia. I mean, Shelley Winter might be a face of it, but we've seen in election after election where Democrats willing to split their ticket or independents willing to split their ticket, Republicans willing to split their ticket, have made the difference. We've called them Kemp Warnock voters. This cycle, we might call them Ossoff Jackson voters. We might just call them the deciders. That's what Brian Robinson, the Jackson spokesman, he coined that phrase way back when. But either way, they play this pivotal role. We know that as many as 8% of Warnock voters also voted for Brian Kemp back in 2022. So there's a significant number of voters. A lot of them live in the sort of metro Atlanta suburbs or inner exurbs, you can call them as well, but they're also scattered throughout the state. There's plenty in rural Georgia as well who might not want to vote straight ticket, who might love Jon Ossoff, but also vote for Rick Jackson. We also might see some Collins Bottoms voters even. I mean, that might be rarer, but we'll see.
Yeah. I mean, I think some of it, Greg, has to do with the power of incumbency. So there may be some Republicans who want to support the ticket, but they also think Jon Ossoff has done a good job over 6 years. So they're willing to support him, even though he's a Democrat, although they'll also support Republicans in open seats. That's something we saw with the Kemp Warnock voters, because Kemp was an incumbent governor that people said, the state's doing pretty well. I think I'll keep our current governor. It's one of the reasons why Sanford Bishop has been so hard to take out down in Southwest Georgia, because he's the incumbent member of Congress. A lot of people like what he's doing and say, we'll keep him around, even though there are a lot of, it's a pretty conservative area. So Republicans tend to win down there. But those same Republicans vote for their congressman, who's a Democrat. And I think we'll see that. Again, we know that Ossoff and Bottoms and a lot of the Democratic ticket are going to try to get those deciders to go with Democrats this year. And we'll see how that affects, up and down the ballot, how well Democrats do. Because we know, yes, Georgia's a purple state, but generally speaking, Republicans are a little bit favored in these statewide elections. So when Democrats are able to win, it's likely going to be on a ballot where Republicans also win. And I think it'd be very tough for Democrats to kind of like sweep everything in Georgia. So we'll look to see if Ossoff wins. Is he the only Democrat, or are there others,
And if you're one of those decider voters, we'd love to hear from you. Email me at gbluestein, Bluestein, at ajc.com. We're going to be following a lot of these deciders as this race continues. You may have made up your mind. You may not have made up your mind. You might be open to all four candidates for all I know, but we'd love to hear from you. That's going to do it for today's edition of Politically Georgia. If you found us on YouTube, welcome to our channel, and please click the subscribe button so you never miss an episode. You can also follow the Politically Georgia podcast on Apple, Spotify, or any podcast platform. Wherever you're listening, we always appreciate your comments, your ratings, and your reviews. We'll talk to you next time on Politically Georgia from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution.
Thanks for listening to the Politically Georgia podcast. Our executive producer is Shane Backler. AJC's head of audio is Sam Stamler. Production support from our partners at Goat Rodeo, including Kara Schillen, Hazel Hoffman, and Max Johnston. For more of our political coverage, visit ajc.com/politicallygeorgia, and we invite you to support local journalism by subscribing to the AJC. Join us again next time on Politically Georgia from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution.